Hi, I'm Theo, and these broadcasts are to support the blogs on nomorec.com's website as well as the online classes. In this episode, What is the Canon? Part 1. Welcome back to another series in the No More C broadcast. We're going to begin today's discussion with what is the canon, and we're referring to the biblical canon here. The word canon in English comes from the Hebrew word, possibly, kana, which means reed. For instance, if you look at Ezekiel chapter 40, verse 3, when he brought me there, behold, there was a man whose appearance was like bronze, with a linen cord and a measuring reed in his hand, and he was standing in the gateway. So it's measuring, and so when we're trying to measure something, and we have to include only certain things in our measurement. And so that's the idea behind the canon. And we have in Ezekiel 42:16 again, he measured the east side with the measuring reed 500 cubits by the measuring reed all around. We're basically measuring a limitation. And so the canon limits certain things that can exist. And so when you measure something, you're giving its dimensions, and so you're figuring out the confines from which something can exist. And so the biblical canon is a measuring system used to decide or determine which books, as we talked about in our previous series or video on the Bible, which books are to be included and which are not. And that's very tricky because different traditions within those communities that worship Yahweh, they have different ways of doing it. And even within different portions of Christianity itself, there are groups that have different listings in their canons of how they measure what is the Bible. So, these are using measurements of, in Ezekiel, of the temple and the sacred space. So different Christian traditions have different canons and how they measure which books are included and which are excluded. And we've been discussing those in our videos lately. So the Greek word is, again, much closer. So, and if it's a transliteration of the Greek and coming from that has the basic meaning of assignment or rule. And if you think about it, in the ancient Near East, there's something called cosmic geography that we talked a little bit about, and we're going to explore in other videos at some point. And the idea of cosmic geography is that there's a certain piece of property or a certain delineation of geography, a certain ground or a certain limit that we assign a rule of a divine being. And so a divine being rules a certain turf. So think of like street gangs, and they have their certain turf that they are ruling over. And then you go cross out of their boundary into another area of the city, and it's a different street gang who rules that particular neighborhood and those portions. And so the idea of, again, assignment or rule. And so when we're looking at like the ESV, it's an area influence. It's the king rules a certain geography, and he has influence over that geography. And it may include vassal kings underneath him, but that's his assigned role. And when we talk about like the government systems, where we've talked about in the past prime minister in videos, the ministers have certain assigned rules, or they're based on geography, so they're elected to represent a specific people within a specific geography, but they're also assigned specific tasks. If they're a secretary of, a certain sector of the government to serve the people, so their responsibilities are determined over a certain thing. And you'll see that in the various gods in the pantheons, where certain gods have powers that are associated with certain things, elements, and their delineation. So they have a certain area of influence, and to get influence, you need to then work with a different god. For instance, someone perhaps in the Hindu religion may worship a certain god. Perhaps their main deity is Saraswati, which typically is understood to be the god of education and they have chosen for whatever reason to make Saraswati their primary deity. But they still might approach the goddess Saraswati to then approach the goddess Lakshmi, who happens to be the god of fortune, or the god of, kind of like money or fortune, or in that sense. And so if you need money to get education, you might be asking the goddess that you worship primarily, Saraswati, to then approach the other goddess, Lakshmi, then to somehow help you out with some fortune so that you can get the education. So they kind of, do that system, whereas same thing, if you're connected to a certain minister who's a Secretary of Defense, but you need something concerning transportation because you're trying to deal with a military airport. Airport is transportation, but military is Secretary of Defense, so those two things could combine, and you need to contact one minister or secretary then to then concern the other. And of course, involved in that also might be the Ministry of Finance, because you might need funds, and so you're going to have to contact the Secretary or Minister of Finance, and there's Commerce, and there's all these things that are going to overlap, and you're going to have to get who has the proper area of influence and work through all those channels. So we do that in our government, even in the modern world. And there was a sense where you had kings, and they had vassal kings that had different responsibilities and had different portions of geography over which they were also to rule. So when we're talking about divine beings in the ancient Near East and the ancient world itself, we're talking about how humans understand the universe works and the cosmology. And it works along the lines of human governments that mimic what's going on in the heavens. Thus you have a divine council, and any common person that would be required to be a part of a court of law or a system of law would be foreign to that realm, and they would have to hire an advocate, and that advocate would then represent them before the rest of the court. And cases are presented, and that person would have their advocate as their mediator represent them in the court of law. And their advocate would present their case before the court, and other members of the court would then be involved, and a judgment would be made, and the judge would have the final arbiter of the decision, and the decision handed out as the judge rules over the court and all those involved in the court. And so any common person is most likely going to be unfamiliar totally with how things work in that realm, and they're going to need someone to operate in that realm for them. And we see this in the ancient Near East, obviously, when we have priests, and priests represent people in the divine area, in the divine area of life, in the divine sanctuary, whereby most commoners are not going to be familiar. And it's quite possible that most commoners would not even have necessarily to have read the texts that we read today and understand them. They would need someone who was literate, help them understand and mediate even the text itself, to understand what the text is saying, as most would be illiterate, and they would have to be told, and then it would have to be explained to them. And so many pastors preach sermons based on the Bible to explain what the biblical text means. And we go to experts in the field of biblical studies, and we learn from them through commentaries and things produced to understand what's going on, because we need mediation. These people are delineated in their realm as their rule. This is their area, sphere of influence, in which they understand what works and what does not work, and how to interact in such a setting. And so this is what is behind all this when we talk about cosmic geography, and we talk about a divine council and the divine court scene, and how your advocate, your God, your deity goes before the rest and pleads your case on your behalf, and how they have messengers that mediate from the divine council to you, whether those messengers be people like prophet, priest, and kings, or whether it goes beyond that. And what we have is like the more angelic or spiritual beings that then also provide some mediation to that as lower divine beings, and bring the rule of the council to you and represent you to the divine council. So then attached to this idea is which decrees are divine, divinely inspired, divinely ordained, divinely given through different forms of mediation, and which ones do we accept as having authority over us, and which ones do we decide have more authority than others, and all of that is included in this discussion. That's the idea, this assigning or this formulation, this dividing up of things. And so certain books within the canon might cover certain topics, and certain other books might cover a different topic, and there might be some overlap, but you might be more inclined to go to certain other books to figure out certain topics, and then there might be strands that run throughout where they kind of cover the same ground. Anyway, in the Old Greek, the Septuagint, interestingly, this term that we get the possibly transliterated into English canon can be basket. And again, it goes back to that reed again, basket of reed, a rail, a bedpost, or a hedge of thorns. And the thorns would be some kind of a protective fence to kind of cordon off or assign a boundary wall. So you kind of see that. And in my dissertation research, I came across quite a bit on boundaries. And again, geography is simply where you cordon off an area and choose this is the area. So if you're a citizen of a country, then you have boundaries that bound you. And we're talking about how we choose which areas are authoritative over us. And you can choose to move to another country, and then their rule is over you because you've changed your boundary. And I correlated that with chaos comp and taking a jungle or wilderness area and putting a fence around it, a gate around it, and marking it off, and then cultivating that and taming that chaos and producing life from that which before did not exhibit life. And we go in Logos to everyone knows in my videos I use Logos regularly, the biblical sense lexicon I use on a regular basis, either a line of comparison or a delimited area, this certain area. And obviously the delimited area is more in use when we're using this word as opposed to its line sense. For instance, let's go to Galatians 6:16 here, and using the ESV, which well integrated in Logos, so I go ahead and use that version most of the time. And as for all who walk by this rule, peace and mercy be upon them and upon the Israel of God. So there's a rule by which, and it kind of goes back to some of our instructions in earlier videos on Torah and what we discussed about Torah and how it works as some kind of a rule of life, a rule of law. Well, this same Greek word here, canon, can, apply to that which rules your life, which orders your life, that you walk according to this way. And so you choose to walk that way. And so they set up a measuring system to standardize, and it has to fit these requirements. And if it fits these requirements, then it is biblical text. It's scriptures, holy scriptures. And if it doesn't, it's not. It's left out. And again, the assignment role, and certain people have a certain way that they live and they choose to live. Even within Christian traditions, there are certain people that live one way, and you might call them Baptist, or they live another way, you might call them Pentecostal, or they live another way, and they might be considered Roman Catholic, or they follow certain rules of their life, and they order it, and their life is ordered by that system of thought within the Christian religion or Christianity itself. And so they're ordered by that way of life. And so then we choose which books fit in the canon, and we kind of organize them and we categorize them in certain aspects. The Pentateuch, the first 5 books, Torah and the prophets. And then we have the former and the latter, and the historical books in there. And then we have the writings, where we have the poetical books, but we also have the, other interesting writings that fall into that category too. So it's not just the poetical books, but, the writings have other things of interest. And so, dividing up how you divide up in what you consider Hebrew scriptures, or what you consider what some people have called the Old Testament within Christianity. Another example of the use of this word, the Greek word, in the New Testament appears in 2 Corinthians 10:13. But we will not boast beyond limits, but we will boast only with regard to the area of influence God assigned to us to reach even to you. And, practical theology is going to discuss with ministers and people who are going to give themselves in service. And to any Christian, there's only so much you can do. There's only so much area of influence. And scholarship, it's very difficult to cross one's area of influence and go into another area where you're untrained. And so it's this area of influence where some people have specialized in academics, and they're an Old Testament professor, a New Testament professor, or they're biblical theology or systematic theology, or they're practical theology, and there's different ways to delineate. Even here, Paul talks about that each one has an area of influence over which God has assigned them. And much like the gods of the ancient Near East, and different gods, even in the Greco-Roman religion, different gods were assigned to different city-states. And those city-states chose a certain god or goddess, certain deity that was over that area, and they chose to pay the most homage to that specific deity while still paying homage to the other ones. But they're noted for one specific deity who has prominence in that area of influence. And so different cities often had different deities that were over that area. Well, the Bible teaches in a sense that believers also, so pastors of a church or a specific congregation might have an area of influence. You obviously would find it very odd to have two Methodist churches on the same street in the same block. Obviously. So the idea is, and before the church grew to the extent that it has grown in recent centuries, the idea was to have one church in your area was a blessing indeed. And so that church would hold the influence over that entire area. But to be able to have the choice that we have today to jump into some form of transportation and find ourselves picking and choosing among so many churches is quite, a new thing for people just to make choices. We didn't have that in the entirety of history. It was often just one church had an area of influence over that specific area. And you often, unless you lived on the boundaries and it was easier to walk to either this direction or that direction to do two different churches, most part, there's only one church in your area, and it had the area of influence. And so Paul is recognizing that there is some kind of demarcation or delimitation of delineating this area is assigned to this spiritual area influence in this area, tying cosmic geography, to the church in some sense. Now, what's interesting, if we switch to the New Revised Standard Version, how they translate this Greek term is with the word field. And that provides a wonderful way of understanding this in English. Where we talk about a field, we could talk about it agriculturally, where a farmer marks off a piece of land and he cultivates his field for crops. Or we talk about one's field in academics, and that field is education, or within education they have a certain field, and it's demarking an area of influence over which you have authority, whereby, because of your credentials, someone has chosen to put their trust in you as a student or as an institution, that you have gained influence in that area. You have authority. Anyway, back to kingdom ethics that we have discussed in these video lectures often. I like what they talk about in the community aspects. And so we have Gushie and Stassen. And canonization, when we're talking about the Bible and biblical text and what is Scripture and what it's not, is the process by which the Christian church sorted through the various texts emerging from the Jesus movement and selected which ones to include in the official collection or canon of text to be treated thereafter as inspired and authoritative. The term can be used more broadly for similar process occurring to any religious community. And so pretty much when the church was growing, this is what happened. Certain writings stood out and held prominence and were widely received and copied and shared more than others. And I often use that for my students, like a Facebook post or a YouTube video that's liked and shared by so many people. The more people that like it, the more share it, the more popular it becomes, the more influence it gains. And people tend to like what they like. So the same thing, they begin to realize which texts were bearing fruit by the Spirit and spoke properly and accordingly and had ties to the apostles and all that. So they measured all of these texts, and then they decided at some point. Initially, they didn't have to because people were just using them. Initially, it was just oral transmission that turned into written text as time went on, and then you have competing written text, and they just realized that these competing texts did not fit up to the mark. And so the people as a whole, through representation, through councils, the church as a whole made some decisions based upon which texts were to be included. And so they had to fit a certain standard, and they had to meet certain requirements. And it is believed that God, by his grace, through the Holy Spirit, watched over the entire process. But it did take some time.
Thank you very much, and God bless you for listening. Stay tuned for more episodes in videos to help you with your journey from nomorec.com.